This is your cue to feed your starter. My starter needs to be fed. If you have a starter, please go feed it. This is your cue. And if you don't have a starter, but you admire those of us that have, thank you. I'm always mindful of her. She's one of the first starters that I'm very proud of. One of the first starters that did very, very well. So I try not to spoil my hard work. I want to keep her active and going. When she's not in the fridge, I place her on the counter and I feed her twice daily. I get a lot of troubleshooting questions from my community, and I decided that I should share a few mistakes to avoid to get a consistent proofing results from your sourdough starter. I would say the number one and most important is not reading the starter in front of you. Regardless of what I say or anyone says, the fact is sitting in front of you. 80% of the mistakes I made could have been avoided if I had only read and listened to my sourdough starter instead of trying to do exactly what I saw from someone else's. We all have unique lifestyles and different climates, so no starter is the same. That's why I prefer to share my experiences and above all, basic guidelines. I learned from someone else's success, but I became successful when I started listening to and reading my sourdough starter. What are the cues to read your starter? The cue of an active starter shows up in a discard even after spending days in the fridge when kept at room temperature. What I call the rising bubbles in my discard starter. I have overlooked this cue in the past, using a cold discard from the fridge to bake, and it took forever for my bread dough to rise and it was too sour. This is my cold discard starter from the fridge. I will add a fresh discard from the mother starter to it. They look flat and not so active, but leaving the cold discard starter at room temperature makes a huge difference. It will start to rise, increase in volume, and obviously more bubbles. This is now perfect for baking, which I use all the time to make delicious bread. And in this case, using less is more. When I started understanding what I was doing in my sourdough journey, I picked up a few cues on how long it takes my mother starter to peak after feeding it with flour and water. First of all, the bubbles start at the bottom of the jar and move up. The dome shape on the surface layer shows it is still feeding and proofing. Once I notice the flat surface, this shows the starter has peaked. The mistake I made in the past is to feed my mother starter again, not realizing the wild yeast in the starter still has flour to feed on. A float test confirms this. Instead of feeding, I'll stir the starter so the yeast can get more food quickly and place it back on the counter. And a few hours later, it is proofing and rising again, meaning the wild yeast is still feeding. The cue is in how thick and tight the culture feels when stirring it. By the second float test, after allowing the starter to sit for more hours, the culture is more lighter and airy because the yeast has released more bubbles, so it floats. I have baked bread using both float test results, and the proofing was beautiful, and my bread turned out just perfectly. Do you have any particular cues to know your starter is ready for baking? Please share in the comment section below. It is good to learn from your experiences as well. Thank you. So how do I know when to feed my starter? My active strong starter slowly descends by itself when it is running out of food. If you noticed, I was the one who stirred the starter because it had peaked. So my last cue is when it has dropped to the bottom level and remains stagnant, then I feed the starter. Not feeding consistently. Like I said in the beginning of the video, my current starter is the one I am most proud of because I poured everything I've learned into it. From the moment I made the starter, I maintained a consistent feeding pattern to get it as strong as it is now. Feeding consistently does not mean every day. It should be flexible and more to a lifestyle, which brings me to the mistake of not having a consistent routine. My sourdough maintenance routine allows me to build a rhythm with the starter. Feeding it daily and baking once a week has given me experience with sourdough seasonal baking, making recipes, and taking breaks. Not storing your starter correctly. Once upon a time, I decided to dry my starter to go on a long break. Let's just say the long break took longer than I thought. By the time I rehydrated the dried starter, it was all bubbles and no rise. I decided to stick to a form of storage I have tried and is proven to work. To place in the fridge or freeze, I feed the starter as usual, then leave it in room temperature for an hour before storing away. Not washing out the excess starter in the storage jar. I am not for daily washing of the storage jar, but I do once a week. I refresh my jar when I notice my sourdough starter fermenting too quickly because of the excess dried starter left in the jar every time I discard. To avoid feeding less to the increasing starter, I refresh my storage jar once a week. Not understanding hydration. I feel like this is not emphasized enough. Hydration is the amount of liquid in the flour. I remembered reading 100% hydration starter, and I was clueless to what that does, so I just did what I read. The amount of water added to a starter during a feed will determine how quickly it ferments and proves. I live in a hot and humid climate. The combination of that with water equals a rapid fermentation process. Reducing the amount of water in my starter feed to slow it down was very helpful. I use and maintain 80% hydration starter. 10 grams starter, 37 grams flour, and 29 grams water. Depending on the climate you live in, choosing wisely the hydration you want to maintain is key to having a great starter. Without having made a handful of mistakes with my sourdough starter, I would not have a great starter that gives me consistent proven results in my bread making. Use my mistakes as guidelines, and where you're clueless, don't worry about making mistakes. Allow them to teach and help you build a rhythm with your starter.